Sergeant Karl Voss reaches for the hatch handle and stops because the handle is gone, and so is most of the hand that would have gripped it. This is the front third of a Panther, Ausführung G, wedged at an angle into a street barely wider than the tank itself. The gun points at a wall 2 meters away. Whatever it was aiming for, it never got to fire, and the men who crewed it left through the roof in a hurry, or did not leave at all. Snow has drifted into the fighting compartment through a hole the size of a dinner plate. 3 questions sit inside that hole, and they refuse to line up neatly. First, how does a half-track kill a Panther? An M3 half-track carries a 1/4 inch of armor plate on a good day, enough to stop a rifle bullet, and a hopeful prayer, nothing more. A Panther's glacis runs 80 millimeters, sloped, hard, the front of it functionally immune to most of what the American infantry could throw. On paper, this is not a fight. On paper, the half-track loses burns and gets pushed off the road so the column can keep rolling toward the Meuse. Somebody forgot to give the crew the paper. Second, why did the armor not save it? Because the armor was never the point, and the tank commander who trusted it made a mistake that had nothing to do with steel thickness and everything to do with the street he chose. Which brings the third question, the one the wreck actually answers if you stand there long enough in the cold and look at the angles. What happened on this street? Not the version in the after-action report, which is 3 sentences and a grid reference. The real one, with the timing and the mud. The man who decided to back a thin-skinned truck into a dead end on purpose. This is the part that shouldn't be possible. The thing this whole story turns on. The crew didn't survive that street by being tougher than the tank. They survived by making the tank's greatest strength completely irrelevant for about 90 seconds, and 90 seconds was all they needed. If a story like that is worth an hour of your evening, do the small things that keep it findable. Like it, subscribe, and drop a comment with the vehicle you want dismantled next, because the algorithm listens to that more than it listens to me. Send it to someone who still thinks armor thickness is the whole story. Now, back to the street. The Panther weighed 45 tons. The half-track weighed 9. Weight is a strange thing to bring up in a fight, until you understand what the street did to both of them. And the street did very different things to 45 tons than it did to 9. There is a temptation, standing at wreckage like this, to make it a parable. Little truck beats big tank, David and his sling, the plucky Americans and their improvisation. I want to be careful here, because that version is mostly wrong, and it insults the men who actually did the work. Nothing about this was plucky. It was cold, deliberate, and worked out in advance by people who understood exactly what a tank cannot do when you take away its room to move. The Germans understood tanks better than almost anyone alive in 1944. That is precisely why what happened here should have been impossible, and why the crews who found this hulk later kept coming back to look at it. The records give the date as the 17th of December, 1944, the second day of an offensive the Germans called Wacht am Rhein, and everyone else eventually called the Bulge. The village is small enough that the sources spell its name 2 different ways. The exact time is not in the file. One account says late morning. Another says the light was already going, which in the Ardennes in December means sometime after 3. The radio log, if there was one, did not survive. What survived is the front third of a Panther, jammed in a street it should never have entered, killed by a truck it should never have feared. Everything else is the answer to how. 4 barrels traverse together, and the man behind them is looking for something in the sky that isn't there. His name is lost. The gunner on this particular mount, on this particular morning, does not make it into any file I can find. What he was trained to do is not lost at all. He was trained to put a wall of 50 caliber fire in front of a diving aircraft, lead it, and let the aircraft fly into the stream. That is the entire design philosophy of the thing he sat in. The mount was the M45 Maxson turret. 4 Browning M, 2 heavy machine guns bolted into an electrically driven cradle, dropped onto the bed of an M3 half-track and designated the M16. Ordnance built it for one job: kill airplanes. The Luftwaffe in 1942 and 1943 still had teeth, and American columns on the move needed something that could throw fire straight up in a hurry, faster than a man could crank a manual mount. The Maxson turret could slew at a rate no human arm matched, driven by its own small electric motor and a pair of 12-volt batteries, and it could hold 4 guns on a moving target in 3 dimensions. The numbers are almost silly. Each Browning fired around 450 rounds a minute. 4 of them together put out roughly 1,800 rounds a minute when all 4 ran clean. A 50 caliber slug leaving the muzzle every 15th of a second or so in a cone. The gunner didn't aim at a point. He aimed at a volume of air and filled it. The troops named it the meat chopper. Some units said meat grinder. The name did not come from aircraft. Intent and reality part company here, the way they do with almost every weapon that survives contact with an actual war. By the time these mounts reached the Ardennes in force, the Luftwaffe that justified them was mostly gone from the daylight sky. American fighters owned the air over the Western Front so completely that a German soldier who saw an aircraft in daylight assumed, correctly, it was hunting him. So the anti-aircraft gun spent most of its time with all 4 barrels level, or even depressed, pointed at hedgerows and tree lines and the upper windows of houses. A weapon built to reach 13,000 feet was being used to hose down a wood line at 300 yards. The infantry loved it for exactly the reason ordnance never planned. Against troops in the open, against a squad caught crossing a field, 450s on an electric mount did not wound. Field reports from units in Normandy and later in the Ardennes describe the effect in language the writers clearly struggled to keep clinical. One American officer, writing up the employment of the weapon, put it plainly: "There is no more demoralizing weapon on the battlefield. Troops caught in the open simply cease to exist as a fighting unit." That is the quote, and I want to sit on the phrase for a second, because cease to exist as a fighting unit is a bureaucrat's way of describing something the bureaucrat did not want to write down in detail. The men on the receiving end used a shorter vocabulary when they could still use any. Against a tank, none of this should matter. A 50 caliber round, even 1,800 of them a minute, does not penetrate 80 millimeters of sloped frontal armor. It does not penetrate the 45 millimeter side of a Panther's hull either, not reliably, not from the front arc, not at the ranges a village street allows. Ordnance knew this. The crews knew this. Nobody issued the M16 as a tank killer, and no manual I have read pretends otherwise. The weapon in that street was, on every specification sheet, the wrong tool pointed at the wrong target, which is the whole puzzle, restated with the serial numbers filled in. A gun designed to kill aircraft, repurposed to kill infantry, ended up with the front third of a Panther, to its credit, on a street in the Ardennes. The barrels never had the penetration to do it the obvious way. So the crew did it a different way, and the different way depended entirely on the one thing 4 fast-slewing barrels could do that no tank gun could match. Everything hinges on that one capability. Before the street makes sense, the street itself has to be understood. The walls, the corner, the dead end the Panther drove into. 90 anti-aircraft gun battalions were in Europe by that December, and most of them had almost nothing left to shoot at. The Luftwaffe had been swept out of the daylight sky over France so thoroughly that the men who trained for 2 years to track diving aircraft were now, in the strictest sense, unemployed at their trade. The Army had a surplus of highly specialized troops sitting on weapons the war had made half obsolete. What the Army did with that surplus is the part of the story that never gets told, because it isn't glamorous and it doesn't fit the recruiting poster. It reassigned them. Anti-aircraft battalions got broken up, parceled out, and handed to infantry and armored divisions as extra firepower on the ground. Their 4-barrel mounts pointed level at whatever the division commander needed suppressed. The unit that matters here belonged to that arrangement. An automatic weapons battalion attached forward, its M16 scattered across a sector of the Ardennes, in 2s and 3s to cover crossroads and thicken up the line. On the 16th of December, that line was quiet, in the way a frozen pond is quiet. The First Army thought the Ardennes was a rest sector, a place to season green divisions and refit tired ones, thinly held on purpose because nobody's sane attacks through 80 miles of forest and river gorge in winter. The Germans, being neither sane nor predictable that month, attacked through exactly that. 20-some divisions came out of the fog before dawn on the 16th, and the thin American line came apart in places within hours. And it got worse. The units holding the shoulders of the breakthrough were, in many cases, the ones nobody had planned to fight with. Engineers who came to build bridges ended up defending them with rifles. Cooks, clerks, and truck drivers got handed a carbine and a map reference, and the anti-aircraft crews, the men with the fast electric turrets, suddenly found themselves as some of the heaviest sustained firepower left standing on a collapsing front. Their radios carried orders that made no tactical sense against their equipment. Hold this village, cover this road, stop whatever comes down it. A battalion built and trained to protect columns from the air was being thrown forward, piecemeal, to plug holes in a ground battle against tanks it could not penetrate. Picture one of those crews on the morning of the 17th. The half-track holds a driver, a gunner, and 2 or 3 men to feed ammunition, plus whatever infantry are clinging to the sector alongside them. The mount carries enough .50 caliber to make a field impassable to men on foot for as long as the barrels last. Against a Panther rolling down the main street of a village, it carries nothing that will pierce the front plate. The crew knows this. They have been told correctly that their job in a situation like this is to strip the infantry off the tanks, kill the grenadiers riding the hull and walking beside the tracks, and leave the tank itself to the bazookas and the tank destroyers. Suppress the men. Let someone else handle the armor. That was doctrine, and doctrine was sensible, and doctrine assumed there was someone else. In a lot of these villages, on that particular morning, there was no someone else. The tank destroyers had pulled back or hadn't arrived. The bazooka teams were somewhere in the fog with 3 rockets between them. The line was a suggestion. What the crew actually had was a fast-slewing turret, a dead-end street, and a Panther about to enter it, and no help coming for the part of the problem they were not equipped to solve. That is the situation, laid out flat. A weapon that cannot kill the tank, a crew ordered to hold anyway, and terrain that was about to become the only weapon that mattered. The German column pushing into that village was not lost or desperate. It belonged to the spearhead, moving fast, exploiting the collapse exactly as planned. Tanks and grenadiers rolling through towns that were supposed to fall in an afternoon. The men in it had every reason to believe the town ahead would fall like the others. What they did not account for was a street that narrowed, and a truck that had already worked out what 45 tons cannot do when the walls close in. What does a Panther actually see from inside, moving down a village street? Less than anyone imagines. The commander in the cupola has a decent field of view when he keeps his head out, and in the Ardennes in December, with grenadiers being scraped off hulls by 50 caliber fire 2 towns back, keeping your head out was a way to lose it. Buttoned up, the driver looks through a slit. The gunner sees whatever the gun is pointed at, a narrow cone, and nothing to either side. A Panther is a superb machine for killing things at 1,000 meters across open country, which is precisely the country it was designed to fight in. The steppe and the rolling farmland, where its long 75 could reach out and kill a T-34 before the T-34 closed the distance. A Belgian country lane is not that country. The cold made everything worse, the way cold always does with machinery and men. The Panther's crew rode inside a steel box that never warmed, breathing their own exhaust when the following wind was wrong, the fumes seeping up through the fighting compartment until the men at the rear felt the dull headache that meant carbon monoxide and could do nothing about it but crack a hatch and let the freezing air knife in. Frost formed on the inside of the armor, vision blocks fogged and iced. The engine, a Maybach that ran hot and thirsty even in summer, drank fuel the offensive did not have enough of, and the whole column moved in the stink of unburned gasoline and hot oil and the particular grease and cordite smell that lived inside every tank ever built. Outside the slit, the world was gray snow, dark timber, and stone houses pressed right up to the roadway with no setback, no verge, no room. The frontal armor could not solve the problem. A street too narrow to turn in takes the tank's best weapon, 80 millimeters of sloped glacis, and points it at a wall. Armor only protects the direction it faces. The Panther's sides ran 45 millimeters, its rear thinner still, and the moment the hull was committed into a lane, it could not pivot in. Every one of those thin surfaces was hung out for anything positioned off the axis of advance. The tank could still shoot straight ahead. It could not bring its armor to bear on a threat beside it, because bringing armor to bear means turning the hull, and turning the hull requires room the street refused to give. 45 tons in a stone corridor is not a fortress. It is a thing wedged in a slot, strong in one direction and naked in every other. Doctrine knew this. German armor doctrine was emphatic that tanks did not enter built-up areas without infantry clearing ahead of them, precisely because a town flattens all the advantages a tank is built around and hands them to a defender with a short-range weapon and a good position. The manuals were clear. The grenadiers were supposed to go first, on foot, into the houses, and only then would the tanks follow into a street already scrubbed clean. That was the sensible version. The version that actually happened on the 17th had the grenadiers thinned by 3 days of fighting and the schedule screaming for speed. The whole offensive built on a clock that demanded the Meuse before the American air forces could fly again, and speed meant sending the tanks in ahead of the men who were supposed to protect them. The doctrine did not fail because the Germans forgot it. It failed because the timetable overrode it. So picture the lead Panther nosing into the village, buttoned against the .50 caliber that had already stripped its riders, half blind, breathing its own poison, the street narrowing ahead in a way the commander could not fully read through a fogged slit. Behind it, more tanks, nose to tail, each one filling the road so completely that the one in front had nowhere to reverse into. The column had length and weight and a beautiful gun, and it had just fed its head into a stone funnel where none of that counted. The one thing it needed, room to turn and put its armor toward the threat, was the one thing the street had been built 300 years earlier, and for entirely other reasons, to deny: 6 meters. That is roughly the width of the street where Voss's Panther died, curb to curb, and a Panther is a little under 3.5 meters wide across the tracks. Do the arithmetic, and the tank has about 1.25 meters of clearance on either side, less where a doorstep juts or a cart is abandoned against a wall. A hull that needs a turning radius measured in the length of the vehicle cannot pivot in 1.25 meters. Forward is open to it. So is straight back, if the driver is skilled and nothing is behind him. What it cannot do is turn to face something sitting off its flank, and that single geometric fact is the whole kill. Now put the M16 where it actually sat, not head-on in the street, which would only feed it into the Panther's gun and get everyone killed, but tucked at an angle, off the axis, covering the road down its length from a side lane, or a courtyard mouth, or the far end of the dogleg where the street bent. The half-track did not need to kill the tank. It needed to kill everything that was not the tank. The grenadiers walking the walls, the commander's head in the cupola, the vision blocks, the exposed optics, the men in the tank stacked up behind who had to dismount and clear those houses on foot. 1,800 rounds a minute does all of that. It turns the street into a channel nobody can live in, and a Panther with no infantry and a blinded commander in a lane it cannot turn in is not a weapon anymore. It is a 45-ton obstacle blocking the road for the tanks behind it, which now cannot go forward and cannot go back because the tank behind them cannot go back either. That is the killbox. Not a trap anyone drew on a map, just the collision of a weapon that fills volume with fire and a street that funnels armor into a slot it cannot escape. The buildings did the containing. The 50s did the killing. The Germans supplied the timetable that sent the tanks in without the men who would have cleared the buildings first. This was not new, and the Germans should have known it, because they had already lost armor this exact way. 6 months earlier, in the hedgerow country of Normandy, American tank destroyer battalions had learned that the M18 Hellcat, fast, thin, a 32-mile-an-hour gun platform with almost no armor, lived or died by getting off the enemy's axis and shooting the side. In a Norman village or a sunken lane, the Hellcat's speed let it slip to a flank the Panther could not turn to meet, and a 76mm round into 45mm of side plate ended the argument. Same geometry, different gun. The tank's strength pointed one way, and the fight came from another. One of the tank destroyer men who worked those Normandy lanes, A gunner whose battalion history records 3 flank kills in a single afternoon near St. Lo, survived the war, went home to Ohio, and drowned in 1951 in a fishing accident on a calm lake, having outlived every panther that ever tried to catch him and dying in 6 feet of still water. The record does not say more than that. It rarely does. Back to the street. The lesson the Hellcat crews wrote in Normandy and the lesson the half-track crew wrote in the Ardennes are the same sentence in 2 hands. A Panther is a rifle. In the open, it is the finest rifle on the field, and it will kill you at 1,000 meters before you know it is there. Push it into a corridor where it cannot turn. Strip away the infantry that was supposed to protect its blind flanks, and the rifle becomes a length of steel pipe pointed at a wall. Everything that made it terrifying, the gun, the frontal armor, the optics reaching out across a kilometer of steppe, assumed room the street refused to grant. So the half-track did the one thing 4 fast-slewing barrels could do that no tank gun could match. It saturated. It made the street unlivable for flesh, and once the flesh was gone, the tank was just a blind box in a slot, waiting. What actually happened in those minutes on the 17th is the next thing to reconstruct, as closely as the fragments allow. Somewhere around 7:40 in the morning, the first sustained burst goes out, and the account we have of what that felt like comes from the German side, from a grenadier who lived through it and told an American interrogator about it weeks later, a corporal whose name the report abbreviates and whose words survive in translation. He was walking beside the 3rd tank in the column. He said the sound arrived before he understood it as gunfire, a tearing noise he had no category for, and then the man ahead of him was simply no longer standing. That is the whole climax in one sentence, and it repays attention, because it is the enemy telling you what the weapon did before his mind could name the weapon. 1,800 rounds a minute, 4 barrels, and at the range these things happened, 40, 50 meters down a straight stretch of street. There is no ranging, no walking the fire onto the target. The first touch of the trigger is already on top of them. The gunner did not aim at the tank. He raked. He put the stream along the road at waist height, and then dropped it, and then lifted it. And the .50 caliber did to stone houses what it was never advertised to do, which is go through them. A round built to reach a diving aircraft at 1,000 yards does not notice a garden wall at 50. It punches the wall, punches the man behind the wall, and buries itself in the next wall. The grenadiers who dove for cover found that the cover was a suggestion, the same word the whole American line had been that week, and now it was their turn to learn it. On the tanks themselves, the fire did something subtler and just as fatal. It did not penetrate the armor, and it did not need to. It walked across the front of the Panther and stripped the vision blocks, cracked and blinded the periscopes, chewed the exposed optics on the commander's cupola, and hammered the hatches shut by the simple fact that opening one meant putting your head into the stream. The corporal described the lead tank as going deaf and blind while he watched, the commander dropping inside and dogging the hatch, and after that the tank just sat, its gun swinging slowly, hunting for something it could no longer see. He used a phrase the interrogator wrote down, and I keep coming back to. The tank, he said, was looking for us with its eyes already gone. That is the gap. The Germans came into that village expecting the thing they had every reason to expect, another town falling in an afternoon, the tanks doing the work and the grenadiers mopping up. What they got was a weapon designed for an enemy who no longer flew, repurposed by an army with too much of everything and enough sense to point it downward, doing a job no field manual had assigned it. The tracks came next, or the fire found them somewhere in there. The sequence in the corporal's account is not clean, and he admits himself that he spent most of it face down in a doorway. But he remembered the sound of rounds on the running gear, a different note, metal on heavier metal, and he remembered that the lead tank tried to reverse and could not, because the second tank had closed up behind it, and there was nowhere to go. Exactly the slot the street had promised. The column was now a single jammed animal, blind at the head, thrashing, and the fire kept coming down the length of it in bursts that the corporal counted in his memory as lasting hours, and that probably lasted minutes. He did not see Voss die, and he did not know Voss. He knew a sergeant in the lead tank tried to get out through the top hatch when the tank finally started to burn, and that the .50 caliber was waiting on that hatch the way it had been waiting on all of them, and that the man got the hatch open and got one arm and part of his upper body into the daylight, and then did not come the rest of the way. The corporal was perhaps 20 meters away, in the doorway, not moving. He survived by not being worth a burst. So why couldn't the Germans simply do it back? They had half-tracks. They had heavy machine guns, good ones, the MG-42, that fired faster than anything the Americans fielded. The pieces were all on the board. What they did not have was the habit of thinking of anti-aircraft guns as street sweepers, and that gap in imagination turns out to be harder to close than any gap in hardware. Read the Foreign Military Studies reports the American Historical Division commissioned after the war, and a pattern surfaces that the German generals themselves seem half aware of as they write it. Asked to explain American success, they reach again and again for the same word. Material, material, the overwhelming weight of stuff. General von Manteuffel, who ran 5th Panzer Army through exactly this offensive, describes an enemy who could afford to be wasteful, who put automatic weapons everywhere and fired them at everything. And the description carries a faint disbelief that any army would spend ammunition that freely. That disbelief is the answer. The tactic was not secret. It was culturally unavailable. Think about what the half-track represented. An anti-aircraft mount pulled off its assigned job because the Luftwaffe was gone, handed to a crew who had ammunition to burn, positioned by a junior officer who was not asking anyone's permission to improvise. Every part of that sentence assumes surplus, a surplus of guns and rounds, and a surplus of initiative pushed down to men who were trusted to invent a use for a weapon on the spot. The German army in December of 1944 had none of those surpluses. It was scraping fuel out of captured dumps and counting shells, and its doctrine, for all its brilliance, ran downward from the top, not upward from a sergeant in a courtyard. The deeper break is in the expectation the German crews carried into the street, and it is worth naming precisely because it is the whole psychological core of what happened. Armor equals safety. A man inside 45 tons of steel, behind a gun that kills at a kilometer, believes he is the most dangerous thing in the valley, and in the open, he is right. That belief is not stupidity. It is the correct reading of every previous engagement, drilled in across Poland and France, and the whole Russian steppe, where the tank was the predator, and everything soft got out of its way. The street inverted it, and the men inside could not update fast enough, because the update required them to accept that the safest feeling place on the battlefield had become the most fatal, and no drill had ever taught them that. You can watch this failure to update in the FMS accounts of urban fighting, where German officers describe losing tanks in towns and reach for explanations that blame the situation. Bad ground, missing infantry, no coordination between the arms, rather than the machine itself. They are not wrong about any of it. But notice what they never quite say, which is that the tank was the wrong tool the instant it entered the corridor, that its strength was conditional, that all the armor in the world protects nothing when the geometry denies it a direction to point. Admitting that means admitting the predator can become the trapped animal without a single round penetrating its plate, and that is a hard thing to write about the weapon you built your whole war around. Could they have countered it, even without copying it? In principle, yes, and their own doctrine told them how. Send the grenadiers first, clear the houses, never feed armor into a town it has not been scrubbed clean. They knew this. Section 4 is not my analysis, it is theirs, written into their manuals before the war. The counter to the killbox was to not enter the killbox, and they entered it anyway, because the timetable that demanded the Meuse did not care what the manual said. The tactic worked not because the Germans lacked the answer, but because the offensive's own clock forbade them from using it. That is why the armor never mattered. Not because the plate was thin. It was not. 80 millimeters of sloped glacis was proof against almost anything the Americans could put on it head-on. It never mattered, because the fight came from an angle the armor could not face, delivered by a weapon the Germans could not imagine using that way, in a place their own doctrine had told them never to go. The steel was fine. Everything around the steel had failed. The street at first light does not look like a battle, so much as an accident that involves several trucks and stopped time. 5 hulls, according to the after-action tally that survives in the Combat Command's files, though the number wobbles, depending on which document you trust, and whether you count the 2 half-burned assault guns at the rear as kills or as abandoned. The lead Panther sits at its angle with the sergeant still in the hatch, or what the fire left in the hatch, and behind it, the column stands nose to tail down the length of the road, exactly as the geometry drew it. Each tank stopped a few meters short of climbing the one in front. Snow has come down over most of it in the hours since. It softens the shapes and does nothing for the smell, which is diesel and cordite and the other thing, and which the men who walk that street the next morning mention in their accounts without ever quite naming. The half-track was gone by then. Crews like that did not sit in a killed position, waiting for the mortars to find them, and this one displaced sometime after the shooting stopped, leaving nothing behind but the arithmetic of spent brass, which one report puts in the thousands, and which nobody counted precisely because nobody had time. Whoever those men were, they drove out of the record here. I went looking for the mount serial, the battery, a name, and the paper thins to nothing, at exactly the point the story gets good, which is either the ordinary friction of a battalion too busy to write things down, or the plain fact that a flak crew improvising outside its lane did not generate the paperwork a tank kill did. The gunner who did this has no file. I find that more irritating than mysterious. What survives instead is the German side of it, which is the part that matters, because the enemy is the witness. In the interrogation summaries taken from prisoners pulled out of that sector, the same detail keeps surfacing in different men's mouths, translated and abbreviated by different American clerks, and it is not the tanks they fixate on. It is the weapon. Several of them describe the thing that hit them as a flak wagon, and the word carries a specific bitterness once you know what it means to the man saying it. These were soldiers who had spent 2 years being told the anti-aircraft guns pointed up, that the danger overhead was the American and British Air Forces, that the flak protected them. To be killed in the street by one of those guns turned downward is to be killed by your own category error, and you can hear the crews reaching for the word and not quite believing they have to use it. One prisoner, a tank man rather than a grenadier, put it in a sentence the interrogator kept close to verbatim, and it is the second golden thread in this whole story. He said they had been stopped, not by a tank, not by a gun, but by a truck that would not stop shooting. Not by a tank. He needed to say what it was not before he could say what it was, because a tank killing his tank would have been the war working the way it was supposed to, and this was not that. This was 45 tons of the finest armor in Europe, undone by a half-track that in a fair fight it would have brushed aside without slowing, and the man knew it, and the knowing is in the grammar. The village itself has a name in the records, and I am deliberately not leaning on it, because the after-action reports place this action in at least 2 spellings, and the unit diaries do not fully agree on which street, and I would rather tell you the file is muddy than hand you false precision. What is not muddy is the tally and the testimony. 5 hulls, give or take, in a street 6 meters wide. A crew that drove away unnamed. And a column of German prisoners who spent their first days in captivity trying to explain to their captors, and probably to themselves, how the safest machine on the battlefield had died in a lane it should never have entered, killed by the one weapon nobody had told it to fear. 4 barrels, 50 caliber, on a powered mount that could slew faster than a man could run. That combination had a name before it ever reached the Ardennes, and the name was not official. The M16 half-track carried the M45 Maxson turret, and the ordnance manuals called it a multiple-gun motor carriage, which is the kind of phrase a bureaucracy invents so it never has to describe what the thing does. The men who fired it, and the men who saw its work done, had a shorter word. They called it the meat chopper. Some units said meat grinder, and the 2 names ran together in the letters and the unit histories until you cannot always tell which crew used which. The name was earned against aircraft first, and honestly. A German pilot pressing a strafing run into that cone of tracer was flying into something that filled the air with metal faster than he could cross it. But the name took on its second meaning on the ground, in exactly the situation that killed Voss, and the men who renamed it were mostly the men on the receiving end, without a plane to fly. The grenadier's tearing noise, the corporal's phrase about eyes already gone, the flak wagon the prisoners kept naming, all of that is the nickname being earned, in a currency the crews never advertised. The irony sits with me. The Germans did understand this weapon, in one specific way, before the war even reached this street. They had studied American anti-aircraft doctrine. They knew what the Quad 50 was for, and they built their tactics around avoiding it in the air. Fly low, come out of the sun, get in and out before the traverse catches up. Every countermeasure they developed pointed at the gun's designed purpose. None of it pointed at the possibility that the gun would be lowered to street level and used to erase infantry off a road. They defended against the airplane version and walked their tanks straight into the ground version, and the defense they had built was the wrong shape for the threat that killed them. That is the whole American story in miniature. And it is worth saying plainly, because the whole channel is built on the enemy admitting it. The advantage was never a secret weapon. The Panther was a better tank than anything the Americans put in that street. The 88 was a better gun than the 50 caliber. The German soldier was, unit for unit, superbly trained, and the FMS reports the American Army itself commissioned say-so without flinching. The American edge was that a battalion could afford to take a weapon off its assigned job, hand it to a crew with more ammunition than sense of economy, and let a junior officer decide on the spot to point it somewhere no manual had imagined. The Germans could out-engineer that. They could not out-improvise it, because improvisation on that scale requires a surplus they did not have, and a habit of trust they had trained out of their army. The prisoner who said, "A truck that would not stop shooting," was, without meaning to, paying the highest compliment the war produced. He was telling his interrogator that he had been beaten by the second-best machine on the field, handled by men who refused to use it the way the label said. He never learned their names. Neither did I. And then, the reversal, because the record does not stop at the good part. The M16 half-track that ruled that street was already obsolescent when it did it. Within a few years, the half-track chassis was gone from the American inventory. The Maxson mount retired. The meat chopper pulled from service and handed off or scrapped. When American infantry needed exactly this weapon again in Korea and again in Vietnam, they had to reach back and pull the Quad 50 out of storage because the thing that had worked so well had been discontinued for being old. The weapon that broke a Panzer column in a Belgian lane was declared surplus by the army that owned it. The village is still there, under both of its spellings, a farming commune of a few hundred people in the eastern Ardennes. The street is paved now and carries tractors. The company that built the Maxson turret went back to making automotive electrical parts, which is what it had made before the war and what it made after.